we're going to be discussing some elements around digital identity, as well as some segments from Paul's new book. But before I dive into that any further, if you could just please introduce yourself, Paul, tell everybody a little bit about yourself and perhaps what Citizen One is.
Well, good evening or good morning, everyone. Look, my name's Paul Conlon. Obviously, I'm an Australian-born author and also a senior engineer and a product manager. So I've got an honours degree in electronic engineering and a bachelor's in information technology as well, both from the Queensland Uni of Technology here in Australia. So look, my career's been quite a journey. I've worked in a wide range of technical fields, from developing airborne and subterranean imaging systems for mining exploration all the way through to the military. And I've built tech in from the embedded microcontroller level up to cloud deployed microservices and web apps. So it's really across the board. And some of my early career was actually spent in gaming and wagering. So gambling's a highly government regulated domain, where words like, auditing and compliance just roll off engineers' tongues. And I always found it quite interesting how the disciplines of statistics and engineering were being implemented to literally ensure that the House wins, within margins determined tolerable by those in legislative power. But anyway, later in my career, I moved into high precision machine control, specifically within the civil construction space. So we're talking about laser augmented DGPS systems that hydraulically control heavy equipment like bulldozers and excavators. And I guess just like aviation, that's an area that's safety critical. And, that means when the tech or the people behind the tech go wrong, people die. So I quickly learned that the decisions that some of our systems make have a direct impact on human life, and I'm also an ex-Australian Army officer where I held a commission in an engineering corps for some years. And that period of my life also taught me how technology really can dictate the human experience, and the military's one area where rapid identification, often based on simplistic traits or markers, determines life and death. So in effect, my story's been one of really appreciating how the power of technology is a double-edged sword, and how its application to anything relating to human identification and behavior should be treated with much more respect than I think it currently is. So a little background on me there.
That's a pretty impressive set of credentials and history there, Paul, I have to say. Fraser, when are you hiring this guy? Thank you.
Paul won't join us. We're a band of like rascals compared to Paul.
We'll see how the space goes.
Melinda, same question to you, please. Could you tell a little bit more about yourself, what you do, and perhaps a little bit about your book?
Well, I'm not. I don't have the credentials that Paul has, but I probably have a lot of life experience to with what's been going on in the last four years. Writing my book in 2018, when I realised I had an extremely dire situation across the world, the woke narrative was taking over the mindsets of our institutions, our schools, our universities, that we had a fairly dangerous narrative that was being dished out to our children. And I'm just an ordinary person, I own a few businesses. I started writing the book in 2018, realizing that, our freedoms were being suppressed, that people were self-censoring, that people didn't want to talk about it. We lost the art of debate and discussion, and that we were being bullied into certain narratives. So, I and then in 2020, I probably turned into and by 2021, I was with the level of compliance and what people were doing across the world without asking. Missives from the government, really no basis on any facts or data. So I suppose that really improved. I launched my book, You Can't Say That, last year, and that really encapsulated me to go back to our core values and not be afraid to take a stand and not be bullied into certain things. So yeah, that's, I from probably the most least tech background. I call myself a bit of a tech idiot, truth be told. So, I suppose the types of value that I might be able to add to any discussion, I have been and am firmly against it, but I'm happy to be convinced and told how we can implement it going to be part of a totalitarian society.
Due to the nature of the conversations, I'm just going to add a little bit of a disclaimer that any of the opinions expressed are that of the individuals on the panel. If we could request, try not to let it get too political in some areas, because I'm pretty sure we've got some pretty interesting and slightly controversial topics to go over. And if we do get into any kind of tokens or anything to do with crypto, nothing we discuss constitutes financial advice or any kind of investment opportunity. So we'll dive in. Paul, I believe writing this book, you must have had a wealth of research to have to bring together to start writing Citizen One. Now, I know you probably want to read a little bit, as we've discussed in the background, but just before we get into that, how did you start the path? Why did you start writing Citizen One? And what was the research like?
Well, first of all, great with the disclaimer. I think that sets us up for a more open kind of panel here. And before I get into a groove, which I tend to do, I'll just mention that I recognize that we're in a mixed audience here today, so some non-technical people, as Melinda mentioned, and which is great. In fact, raising awareness is one of my objectives. So I'm going to try and phrase everything here in basic enough terms so that everyone can be included, because I think this is a topic that really impacts everyone. With that said, onto the book. So yes, very research heavy. It's called Citizen One, The Case Against Digital Identity. Now, for this particular audience, let me qualify that. It was originally titled The Case Against Government Digital Identity or Centralized Digital Identity, but the publisher said that was quite a mouthful, so it got shortened. But it's a non-fiction about what I perceive as the biggest social and technical threat that humanity is facing at the moment. And contrary to popular belief, it's not AI. So my thesis is essentially that institutions, and particularly governments, are now manipulating or arguably even forcing people into their own bespoke centralized digital ID systems. And they're increasingly making goods and services and even income conditional upon its use. And that's happening right now in this country quite demonstrably. And I make the case that identity under bureaucratic control is extremely dangerous. And so I saw this trend kind of emerging maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I found it pretty scary actually. And I wanted to explain why. So I decided to write a book based on my personal family history in Nazi Germany. So that regime almost literally wrote the book on how to abuse identity. And so I thought I'd write the book on how to protect it. And I've received excellent feedback. I've actually had people reach out to me and say that it's given their concerns a voice. And it's even got a forward from Senator Malcolm Roberts, who's a currently sitting federal Australian senator who's vehemently opposed to government control over digital ID. Now, to get into your question in a bit more granularly, I had a few goals with this book. So firstly, I wanted to explain to people, the average person, the value of identity and what that means and how it's inextricably linked to our lived experiences. I wanted to offer hope and alternatives, and I guess this discussion is part of that discovery of what alternatives may be out there, and I provide some practical suggestions for digital minimalism that people can start implementing right now. And I also wanted to provide, I guess, the definitive reference that connects the political and technical innovations of 1930s Germany with what's happening now. And I'd often hear the same argument against digital ID, and it went something like, we don't want a Chinese social credit system. I'm sure we've all heard that before. Now, although that's true, I felt that there were many more arguments than just that could be made that weren't in the public domain. And so I went out there and spent a few years finding them. And lastly, I didn't just want to write a dry kind of textbook about ones and zeros. I wanted a human narrative that people can relate to. So they were my goals. And as you can probably appreciate, I really struggled to weave all of that together elegantly. And after a complete rewrite, I ended up dividing the topic into 4 pillars. And they are identity, trust, technology, and government. So I spent years deep in the online Bundesarchives. That's Germany's absolutely incredible national archives, where they've digitized volumes of Nazi-era documents that the more time I spent in there, I found they clearly painted a picture of identity possession as a tool of control. And I include a lot of that research in the book, including pictures, and there's everything from original internal party memos through to technical specifications of the equipment they used to process identity cards. And the more I researched, the more I got the chills. You know, that triangle in particular of identity, technology, and government is a dangerous mix. And I can elaborate a little bit on that. Many wouldn't know that some of what we take for granted in big data today and computing today was born from one man in particular, who I've labeled, perhaps audaciously, as the father of tech-driven identity management. His name was Erwin Kunst. Now, Kunst was a Freiburg-born lawyer of all things, but he introduced a concept he called the Personalitätsprinzip or personage principle. Now, previously, citizen data like census information, the type of data that the state would collect, was typically stored and indexed geographically, so by household. So as people would move around between houses, and the data would kind of be locked to that geographical location. And that serves statistics and planning needs quite well, but finding an individual was not a primary function of that system. It was a bit of a needle in a haystack type affair. And Kunst proposed in a personal letter actually to Hitler in 1934 that total control of the population required a shift to something like the indexing of data by the individual, and that was the Personalitätsprinzip. And actually many of Kunst's innovations in identity datification, I suppose you could say, were arguably precursors to computing concepts we now take for granted. You know, things like right balancing algorithms and SQL commands, and even reporting. A lot of that was innovated during that era, I found. And all of this was implemented by a company called De Homag, which was the German subsidiary of IBM at the time. They produced electromechanical machines that encoded identifying data on cards, punch cards, they called Lochkarten, and they automatically error checked them and sorted them according to search criteria. It was revolutionary stuff, and it placed incredible power at the whims of officials. And you know, De Homag machines allowed officers to really quite fundamentally quickly locate people with particular characteristics. This was the consequence of shifting from geographical indexing to individual indexing. You know, they could find married Catholic parents of a certain age range in a specific region, you know, or French speakers with a history of vagrancy arrests. So it was amazingly granular, and the power to find these people was placed in the hand of these machine operators who would configure these machines and then feed in stacks of identity cards, and the machines would separate the cards matching the search query and stack them neatly and print a summary manifest, you know, and these manifests would be used to segregate people for goodness knows what sort of fate, you know. I go into some of those details in the book. So there's a lot for the tech buffs in there, but it's much more than that too, you know. As I weave together the story of my family's survival of these identification and surveillance policies of that era, and present the social implications at the time as well. So my grandmother was German, and she lived in a town called Ratibor, which was right on the Polish border at the time. It's now part of Poland, but she was 16 when she actually saw the Wehrmacht tanks roll in through her town on their way to Poland in September 39. So she was literally there when it all started. And I write about the effects of these government identification policies throughout the 30s and throughout the war on her parents and her household, and the day-to-day anxiety, you know, that's born from not holding custody of your identity data. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I thought if you're willing to suffer me a little bit more there, Matt, I could maybe wrap this up by reading the prologue to the book, which it's short, but I could give you a good feel if that's appropriate now.
It is. It certainly sounds like you've done your homework. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. But before I receive my termination letter in email, I'd just like to apologize for Fraser, who I left out at the beginning as an introduction, which is quite an important part of introducing a panel. So my apologies. But as a decent segue, Fraser, just taking into account what Paul's just said about, the research into his book and about the 4 pillars. If you could just please give the listeners and followers of Paul and Melinda an introduction of yourself, how you got started with cheqd, and what the overall mission is. And my apologies again.
Cool. Yeah, no problem at all. Fraser, CEO at cheqd as of coming up for 4 years, which is slightly terrifying. It feels both infinitely longer than that due to the crypto side of things and somehow a lot shorter, just because of the pleasure of who I get to work with, which used to be Matt up until now. No, thanks, Matt. Don't worry. So prior to this, used to work for Accenture for about, I think 5 to 6 years, doing a mix from, started off with telephony infrastructure, so putting in telephone and data networks for banks mostly. Moved into biometrics, so how you identify customers based on their biometrics, both to smooth the customer journey, but also to kind of eliminate fraud, which is obviously a huge problem for banks at the time. Off the back of that, kind of fell into blockchain, decentralized kind of DLT world, mostly on the financial services side, and mostly because of the background in telephony and data. It's very, very similar tech, big distributed systems, all that kind of jazz. Fell into the blockchain kind of world, working on things like cross blockchain payments. So got a couple of patents there. So, pretty niche technology architecture. Then, due to a mix of having the biometrics background and the blockchain side of things, then ended up leading a project with the World Economic Forum and the Dutch and Canadian governments on using decentralized or digital ID for international travel. So the ability to have a digital version of the passport, digital version of all of your boarding passes, combine those together and be able to use those to cross borders using biometrics alone, with the aim of not having to present any data. And around the same time was working or kind of doing sales engineering or sales calls for self-sovereign or decentralized ID into various corporations, companies worldwide, cross industry, and pretty consistently was hitting the same snag, which is there needed to be a commercial model to kind of release data from these companies and get it back under the control of individuals. And without that commercial angle, all of these conversations were always going to be very, very difficult. And so after about hearing maybe 6 to 9 months of like, even inside companies that make their money from selling data, love the idea, love the paradigm, want to give the data back, want to improve the customer experience, can't make it work out financially. So after, I think, 6 to 9 months of hearing that, jumped ship with Anchor, one of the co-founders alongside Javed, our CFO, and founded cheqd, all with the aim of, incentivizing decentralized ID, getting that data back with individuals, and hopefully giving back them kind of ownership, control, and privacy as well. Thanks for that, Matt, and back over to you.
Thanks, Fraser. Yeah, pretty important points now you've mentioned, Fraser, especially in relation to some of the points that Paul's just been touching on. But yes, Paul, if you wouldn't mind, because there sounds like there's a lot to get in here in your book. So if you could share a little bit of a blurb from your book now for us all to get an insight of what it's about.
Yeah, that'd be my pleasure, and I certainly hope that termination letter doesn't arrive. So, okay, so
Neither do I.
Yeah.
I'm saying nothing. Just keep on his toes.
Keep your options open. Yeah. So I'll read the prologue. It gives everyone a little bit of a taste. Here we go. Danke, bitte, guten Tag. Thanks, please, good day. 4 simple German words that irrevocably altered the course of history for my family. 4 simple German words hastily thrown together by a US Army soldier during his mission to liberate Berlin in 1945. His rifle was pointed directly at a terrified young German woman. His bloodied finger quivered over the trigger. That young woman was to become my beautiful and gentle grandmother, my Oma. The soldier struggled with the dilemma before him. He struggled to identify her. Was she just a German who should be slain like the many others who had stared down his barrel over the prior weeks? Or was she simply a young woman caught in the crosshairs of a horrifying war, deserving of a chance at life? Did her identity span both possibilities? Identity is a matter of life and death in government hands. To the Nazi government, otherwise known as the Third Reich, my Oma's fate was of no concern. She was just a number, stamped on a mandatory ID card years prior and left to the whims of invading soldiers. Are we forgetting history's lessons? How do they apply to you in the digital ID age? Today, we are sleepwalking into a societal restructure based on uneven information sharing between ourselves and our governments. A structure where our identities are becoming transparent to government, while government is becoming opaque to us. A structure that we now, like Germans then, would not have chosen had we been paying more attention. This book exposes the enduring justifications for centralized identity registration and their predatory outcomes. It challenges the belief that this time it's different. Together, we will explore the essence of identity, trust, technology, and governmental power, revealing the simple fact that some will always seek to exploit these for harm. But amidst these horrors, this is really a story about love over coercion. My family history shows how love can fulfill our collective responsibility to resist the datification and commodification of our identities, and it is my honor to share it with you. And with that, I'll hand the mic back. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you for sharing that, Paul. There's certainly a few things in there that I can definitely relate to in terms of how we could be headed, and we've all certainly seen various projects and implementations which we might deem slightly questionable when it comes to our inalienable rights as humans and our human identity, which kind of brings me on to my next question. We can talk about digital identity as a bit of a sweeping term. You know, different people have different interpretations. And so a question for you, Paul, how easy would you say is it to accurately identify a human life?
Yeah, you're totally right there. Hit the nail on the head. It's a simple term that hides all manner of complexity, and in many ways it's a square peg in a round hole scenario. So researching for this book made it very obvious that humanity is just infinitely nuanced, and trying to define it has confounded philosophers for millennia. And identifying and categorizing a human life using digital systems that at their core require precise modeling is, in a way, fighting for what you've already lost. And Phil Windley nails this in his book, Learning Digital Identity. He likens our identity systems to a bundle of sticks, he calls it. So we have a collection of known facts about people that we group together to say effectively, you've been verified. And there's no rule on how many of these sticks is enough. You know, that may consist of a phone number or your address and so on. And a lot of these properties or characteristics are repurposed. So my phone number is for people to call me, not to identify me. I don't give my phone number to my neighbor to identify me. So it's really difficult to make centralized determinations here. And the perceived utility of using identity markers to make centralized determinations about people comes at a big cost. And look, I'll give you an example from my career. In recent years, I've worked with AI-based safety systems, and particularly in their training. And it's a great lens to view this question through. So one was a vision-based system that was installed on an excavator, and we were training it by wearing typical construction site attire, high-vis jackets and hard hats, and we were posing around the machine in positions that it could expect to see in the real world. So holding tools and using a phone and maybe sitting on a bench with a chicken sandwich or whatever. And through repetition, these vision systems get better at identifying humans and, either warn the machine operators that there's one within proximity or intervene and cut the hydraulics. But although these systems are impressive, we would still see false positives, when they saw a jacket hanging over a chair, for example, and of course plenty of false negatives too. And just for the non-technical in the audience, that just means getting things wrong by thinking someone's there when they aren't, or thinking they're not there when they are, and look, at the end of the day, getting things wrong is a fundamental characteristic of human identification systems. I don't think we can change that, but what we can change is the consequences of getting it wrong and who we empower with these decisions. So yeah, it's tricky to identify people, and it's an area where we need to put a lot of careful thought in.
Indeed. Taking into account what you said there, defining people and their characteristics as a bundle of sticks, or more commonly heard, just a number or a barcode. It's another challenge itself to shift the perspective, I believe, to get people to understand, certainly from the human aspect, what it means to hold and control that data, which is essentially what these topics are about. Which kind of brings me to my next question about caring about our identity and understanding how important it is to have a little bit of self-security over that. Why should people actually care about their identity, and who holds custody over it?
Yeah, this is something. Have you ever had that feeling where you're just trying to get someone to care about something that they should, but it's hard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, all the time.
So here we are. Like I said in my introduction, identity data is unique in that it has a direct impact on our lived experience. And I find that's unlike any other type of data. So the more people know about you, the more they can influence your decisions and extract resources from you. And it's really not hard to see this everywhere. When you call up your bank, say, you're asked for a particular bundle of sticks, as we were talking about, and it's the bank that determines how many sticks is enough to identify you, like your account number and your name and your PIN and so on. And I write about an experience I had at a bank branch, where I overheard, there was a confused elderly lady ahead of us in the queue, and she over-identified to the teller. So she was spilling details about her son's location and his employer, as well as her account information, and everyone in the queue within earshot heard it, and hence had everything they needed to launch a phishing attack or impersonation attacks. It could be potentially quite profitable. And equally, you see examples of the opposite. There are professions like poker players, where it's predicated on making a living from hiding your tell, because any identifying reaction can result in an opponent's win and the loss of prize money, and the same you see with professional fighters who study videos of past fights to see what moves their upcoming opponents may favor. It's just another example where knowing something about them can increase the chance of winning prize money in this case, or whereas facing an unknown opponent really levels the playing field. So why should people care about who holds their identity? The way I like to put this is to think of every little thing that identifies you as a key. Like those old movies where the jailers would walk around with a big ring, with dozens of keys on it. And every time we maybe use a credit card or show our driver's license, or even reveal preferences or behaviors, or religious associations, any exposure of identity to another party, we're handing out a copy of a key. And you never know what combination of keys someone else can open the doors of your life with, or how many key copies they make. It can really impact you in unexpected ways. And you sometimes hear of those who have experienced identity theft actually liking it to a form of rape. It's quite a visceral imposition. If someone else is walking around identifying as you, then who are you? So I think for these reasons, we really need to take the nuanced parts of our identity very seriously on a day-to-day basis.
Definitely, absolutely. Just taking into account your example there, I've on a few occasions been in the doctor's office, and you stand there, and sometimes what they'll do is they'll shout out your name, and as you're walking toward them, they'll say, "Can you confirm your address, please?" Like, dude, no. And another innocent one, thinking about the keys. I do a lot of hiking. And some random guy, he took a picture of us together just overlooking the fells, and he says, "Hey, I've just taken this picture. Do you like it? Would you mind giving me your email address so that I can send it to you?" And such seemingly innocent acts can actually be themselves a copy of a key. And all it takes is a little bit of social engineering and a light conversation, being friendly, to actually get the combination of those locks. And those are great examples of why we need to be very careful. So I completely agree with how you've just portrayed that there. The other thing is, sorry, I've just lost my place here. There we go. So it's in the advent of digital technology changed the threat landscapes of identification over the analog documents of the aspect. How has that come to pass?
I believe that, and this is from the perspective of an engineer, where it's a bit easier to grasp, but I think in general, people don't understand the digital domain. So in my experience, there seems to be this general conflation of binary with better. And I completely get why that is. I remember the VHS days when DVD was coming out. And I remember the ads you'd used to see where they'd play a sketchy bit of grainy video with some garbage audio, and then they'd contrast it to the digital quality offered by DVDs, and everything was superior. And so I think people have grown up just thinking that when they hear the term digital, they mean that it's better in some sort of abstract way. And, digital systems have amazing properties that have built the world we live in. They're durable, they're highly available, they've got unprecedented levels of editability and speed. But as with everything in engineering, these things come with a trade-off. And the way I'd like to describe the discrepancy there between analog and digital systems and how they relate to identity is analog systems are quite analogous to how we perceive the world with our senses. So you think of vinyl records, the grooves carved in the vinyl records are oscillations that map directly to the vibrations in air pressure, the changes in air pressure that our ears perceive as sound. You may remember playing a record perhaps without the amplifier on, and you can actually just faintly hear the music coming off the needle itself. We can grasp the analog world and we can grasp analog systems, but the digital systems where binary samples are taken, I believe separates us from space and time. And you can see how that's manipulated in things like, I try not to get too technical, but burst error correction is a good example where you can send communication data digitally and it's interwoven within time. So little bits of the data that comes later is actually sent early on, and it's interlaced so that if you get a dropout, it's not sequential, and it's just reassembled at the other end and no one noticed the difference. But we are separated in space and time from our digital data, and a consequence of that is that we can't perceive it with our senses, we don't understand it fully, and we rely on the digital systems and by extension the engineers who program them to faithfully reconstruct our data and make it available to us. I also think there's a philosophical component here, particularly in relation to identity. I don't know what sense it is for identifying data to last longer than that which it identifies. It's kind of like a shadow outliving the object in a way, and it makes sense that physical documents that we're accustomed to, driver's licenses and these sorts of things, they age in tandem with their own bodies. I think there's a poetry to that. I use the Bundesarchives again to demonstrate this concept. There was a top secret memo from Dr. Diego von Bergen, who was the Nazi ambassador of the church at the time. It's a bit inconsequential, but it was concerning the Pope's speech at the 1933 Christmas reception. And Diego von Bergen says in this memo, he explicitly writes of his influence over the speech of the Pope and that he's demanded changes to be more favorable to the regime. And the point there is that if that typewritten memo had been left in analog form on a piece of paper, it would be totally lost to time by now. But it's been digitized and it's sitting there forever in the Bundesarchives for some researcher in Australia to find over 90 years later. So these are some of the factors that are at play when we deal with digital systems, and we need to understand how they relate to the identification of our human existence. And as I said, like everything in engineering, we need to appreciate the trade-offs, because nothing is entirely good and nothing is entirely bad.
Indeed, I would agree with that. Just using your example there of the memo, and had it not have been kept a record of, things might have been different, you know. It's important, I believe, to, as will most people, I'm sure yourself, to keep a record of sorts for historical truth purposes, so that people can understand the facts of what's actually happened and how certain events may have unfolded the way that they have, both from a global, political, and from an individual perspective, no matter. The other thing is just touching on that as well, from a government perspective, and how we, you know, reassemble data and how it's applied to us. To what extent should governments be involved in the management of personally identifying data?
Okay, here we get to the controversial part of the,
yes.
the conversation, perhaps. So I can speak for myself, I guess, here. Who else am I going to speak for? And yeah, as I say, the risk of being controversial here, perhaps, I'm going to give an initial, maybe idealistic answer and say not at all. Now, I do realize that governments are just so entrenched in identity now that this might be an unrealizable in our lifetimes and idealistic, but I still think it's useful to give these questions the kind of respect they deserve and look at them from first principles. I just see it as a matter of the state is increasingly claiming ownership of these identity keys we've talked about through their possession of them, and the citizens are having their resources potentially extracted from them as a consequence. And in reality, however, I think it's a spectrum. So one chocolate bar won't make you fat, and one cigarette won't kill you, but many of them ultimately will. And you never know which exact chocolate or cigarette is the one that tips you over the edge. And I think centralized identity management is a bit like that. You don't know how much exposure results in a problem, and you don't know when that problem may occur. And so in practice, there may be some scope for isolated regional, government departments to issue tightly scoped identifiers, maybe like the DMV type scenario where the identifier only has meaning within that department. Ideally in an environment that's augmented by other private, perhaps SSI offerings that people may choose to adopt. I think choice is a big factor there. But yeah, when you're dealing with these, with governments in particular, I think the issue is largely one of scope creep and the inevitable abuse of power whenever government gets involved in identity management.
I can certainly see why you might think that everything that we do nowadays, certainly in our digital lives, even our physical lives, is predicated on some form of identification. Almost everything that we do, and we can't get away from it. I did want to just bring in Fraser to see if he has any thoughts on that. I'm conscious that it's a little quiet over that side of the panel.
I think that last bit that Paul said around having tightly scoped identifiers is, for me, the key. The reality is, I think really it's more a choice between online privacy and having anyone be aware of what you're up to, whether that's a government or otherwise. I think it's Clearview, which was running out of the US and has now been locked down to government contracts only, was basically able to take a picture of someone and find everything about them from any source online and bring that all into one file. And that was commercial tech, or it was commercial tech for a while, but then has been claimed by the governments as something that really shouldn't be out there in the open. So for me, it really boils down to maintaining privacy versus not. I think if you have a public Instagram profile, if you don't lock down your Facebook, if you're posting stuff online, it doesn't matter what kind of relationship you have with the government, you are discoverable and everything about you is discoverable. But it's not just a government, it's any organization can go and hunt you down. So, I do agree with Paul's kind of thing, where Paul's point around having, government departments be responsible for only like a sliver of the information that they are responsible for. So things like birth certificates, they obviously have a place, they need issuing. It's then how do you make sure that that isn't kind of being shared around? One of the interesting dynamics that I've seen in EU Commission meetings with regards to EIDAS, which I think is positive, is they've been very clear that there should never be a unique ID for an individual, a globally unique ID for an individual. Like that should never be possible. So if they're trying to match people across departments, they need the user's permission and the user to be sharing that data to be able to do so, because there's no UUID to be able to like narrow down to that single individual. And they're very, very much against like one department having a view or purview over all of this, which I think is good. The interesting part is then you've got like the complete flip side, which is SingPass in Singapore, where like the local population has basically just bought into the system where the government has SingPass, it offers it. It has pretty much any document you would get from a government. So anything from your birth certificate, I think it might even have your citizenship and also your ethnicity, I think, is in there as well. And then they build on top of that with like the right to rent, a bunch of other stuff. And the local population is just fully bought in, because the trade-off is they've got their dependent, like if you are a full citizen, your life is incredibly, incredibly easy for now. Because all that data is in one place. So going and renting a house, going and accessing mortgages, all this kind of stuff is very, very easy, because all that data is in one place. So, but I guess going back to it, I ultimately agree with where kind of Paul's spectrum point, and ideally having this like government department there shouldn't be a single government department that has that overall view. But then extending that, I guess, with mine to bring it back around was like, if you're posting stuff online or you're not careful about how data is linkable about you, none of this matters. That even if you want to push back against governments, if you're not taking care of it yourself, you're just opening yourself up to being surveilled by anyone. And you can do, the damage you can do there is very, very quick. So I think a big part of this for me is just privacy, against whoever the other side or the other actors are.
Indeed. Thank you, Fraser. Just very quickly as well, I'd just like to bring in Melinda and just have some thoughts on, I think there's a new bill that's due to go out on the 1st of December 2024. Is it the Digital ID Act in Australia? Please correct me if I'm wrong. Melinda, Fraser, if you could please give me a verbal cue, just in case I don't hear anything Melinda says. But Melinda, what's the feeling in Australian public now towards government involvement in identification processes?
Well, look, there's two aspects to what's going on in Australia right now, broad aspects. The first is that a lot of people don't even know what's going on, and that's a very, very big problem in Australia in and of itself, because if you speak to people about the digital ID, a lot of people that I speak to don't even know that it's happened and that the bill was passed this year. So that's a first very, very big problem, because it never went to a referendum. It should have. It's a big enough deal that it should have gone to a referendum. The way that we had an Australia card go to a referendum years ago, and that was roundly rejected by the Australian people. The same thing with this one, but most people don't even know it's happening. Now, we do know that it's happening. Those people are very, very, very deeply concerned, and the concern has been made more amplified because of what happened between 2020 and 2022. So people got a taste in Australia of what totalitarianism actually means. And we were very, very heavily policed. We were one of the most heavily policed countries in the world. And what that means is that a lot of people actually woke up to the potential of what a digital ID will really mean. And it won't mean it straight out of the gate, but I do public speaking events where I do talk about what life looks like in 2034. And the fact that the digital ID bill was passed in 2024, 10 years earlier, it gives the dog its teeth, if you know what I mean. It allows the dog to grip onto you and not let go. And I call it kind of like the teeth of the dog. It's an enabling piece of legislation, and it's very, very, very concerning. And I hear what everyone says, and I certainly understand a little bit more about cheqd and the way that we've got this amazing company and this amazing person who's going to bring that ID back into the hands of the people. That will be absolutely critical, because I can tell you now that is not the intention of the Australian government at all. The intention of the Australian government is to use the digital ID to gain full control of the Australian population. Yeah. So, yeah, happy to hear anyone's thoughts on that.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Melinda. I did actually hear that, which I'm glad about.
Yeah.
One of the, I had a background in tech for 15 years, and I had no clue about digital identity. And in fact, I was one of the dissident voices that said it's the boogeyman, it's dangerous, and I was dead against it. And it wasn't until I met Fraser and the team, and I learned more about what it is that we're building and the various implementations. That was when I thought immediately, if there's going to be a system that does come in, that benefits people and gives them control of their data, this is certainly a framework that I can get behind. And so I joined. So I can personally appreciate your thoughts, but that's me personally. So thank you. Paul, just coming back to... sorry, go on, Melinda.
I was just going to quickly add that listening to, what Fraser and Paul are talking about, I just wanted to leave this with you, and lead into the next questions that you're going to talk about, is that there are inherent risks with trying to identify a person. And there are inherent risks with digital ID. And from a non-technical perspective, the risks for me are identity theft, which is ruining people's lives. This idea that a person can be then controlled by a government. There's also a risk in the population having a massive lack of understanding of the digital world and what a digital ID would mean. And there's an issue of competency, of people being able to protect people from hacking and from not just identity theft, but competency of looking after data and having systems and processes that allow us to easily free flow information, and government is not competent. So those four things for me, as a non-technical person, the theft, the control, this lack of understanding of the general public, and then being able to have a competent organization and company. I mean, they're, for me, the really key four things that I think we need to get that solved. And I think that cheqd is probably one of the better options for humanity to allow us to solve that. And I think that we've got to go and encompass all of those areas and all of those things when we talk about digital ID.
I totally agree. I think there's a couple of tangible examples, especially with AI coming through, of where if it's done in the right way, it could be really powerful in terms of eliminating fraud whilst maintaining privacy. One of the things that's about to be a big problem for registering for any service at the moment is, I think on the dark web you can get fake passports and fake driving licenses for around $10 to $20 US, which is an absurdly low price point, and it's good enough that it will get through just a simple ID check. So this whole fraud and impersonation has a really high risk of being absolutely rife. And just to give an idea of one of the projects I was involved in when I was back at Accenture, and why, if you do this in the right way with consent, it can be extremely powerful. So we put in a biometric system for a UK bank, focused on eliminating fraud. And the way that it would work is it would listen into, like whenever you call up the bank, basically it will be recorded. It always is, because they have to cover themselves for liability and risk. And off the back of those recordings, they would pick out the ones where they could identify fraud had happened on a different account. And typically the way the fraudsters would work is they would find an account, they'd compromise it, and then they would basically, because they'd learned the process of the bank, they would hit as many accounts as they could in a short window, and then they would just keep on going until they were discovered. And the way that this worked was it would identify the biometrics of the fraudsters based on like manual checks of like, this account was compromised, here are all the phone calls, this is obviously not the right person. Then they'd put it through and compare calls after that on a kind of daily, weekly basis to say, okay, have they called in again on a different account? And it goes back to Paul's example of that lady in the queue. On the first day that we put the system in, we caught a fraudster who had taken over, I think, a 95-year-old's account, and they had managed to get a credit card, or no, it's a debit card, I think, issued in the post. And what would happen is that the address, I think, had either been changed or it was still the current one, but the fraudster would meet the postman before they got to deliver the letter, and they would take it off their hands and then just kind of obviously rinse the account. And because of the fraud system, they basically picked it up. They managed to stop the card in the post before it was delivered. And this was, I think, a 95-year-old bloke. And from memory, it was something like 863,000 quid was in his account. And if that card had landed, all bets were off. Like it could have all disappeared very, very quickly. And obviously there should have been stop limits and all this kind of stuff, but the damage would have been huge. It was basically someone's life savings. I guess all of that to say that, like, the reason you could do elements of that were because the bank itself was able to create this this digital ID or proxy for a digital ID for that individual, for the fraudster, and then try and pick it up elsewhere. I think what's going to become key is if you can generate documents or images that look like document scans of a passport or driving license, suddenly that check goes out of the window. And one of the few ways that you could get around it is basically looking at the way passports are checked at the moment is there's a signature onto the chip. And so you can check where it came from, and you can do the same thing with credentials. And I think, unfortunately, AI is going to push in that direction, where for credentials you'll need to know where it came from in the first place, just because fraud with AI is going to be so rife. I think it already is, but I don't think it's hit organizations at the scale that it will over the next couple of years. Realize that was a long ramble, but all that to say that it's got to be some balance between like individual privacy, but the flip side is going to be having to eliminate or minimize fraud against a wave that is absolutely coming over the next 6 months to a couple of years.
No, they're all important points that have just been mentioned there, because ultimately what we're talking about is, when it comes to the individualistic side of things, we're talking about trust and how easy it can be to trust an individual, and how in many cases the level of trust can be subjective to one person to the next. And in the same way, go on.
No, it's also the optionality. Again, it's one of the things that is good that I keep on hearing in the EU Commission meetings is there's no expectation that every individual should have a digital ID. There's always like, okay, we'll enable this, but everyone has to be able to maintain this non-digital ID, because they're like, for a lot of people, they just never will. There are people that will never get their heads around it. You have problems with like guardianship, people who are unfortunately would be mentally competent to do it. And then you've got people who just opt out. But the good thing is that I've heard, at least in the EU Commission meetings, is like we have to enable that side of things. We have to make sure that people aren't press ganged into a digital ID system that isn't going to function for them, which is good. So yeah, just want to add that in as well.
No worries. Thanks, Fraser. But it is true, though. It shouldn't be something that should be enforced on us, certainly from what Melinda's perspective and some of the topics highlighted in the book from a historical perspective as well. But just getting back to the definition of trust, you do actually mention this in your book, Paul, just coming back to you, to make a better case for the use of the language around the use of the word trust. So in your opinion, or, what have you got to share? Could you elaborate on how this relates to identity management at scale, Paul?
Yeah. So trust is one of those big pillars. I devote an entire chapter to it, as I mentioned, because it really is key to what we're attempting to get to here by the use of identity. And in the book, I thought long and hard about how do I communicate my thoughts around this. And one prism to view this through is physics. So I liken trust to physics. So if we think about how we understand the world around us, in physics we have kind of two main theories, simplistically. There's one describes the large scale, like planets and stars, and we call that classical mechanics. And the other explains the really small scale, subatomic particles, and we call that quantum mechanics. And even though these two views of reality are quite different and even contradict each other, they're both validated in their respective domains. Like classical mechanics will accurately predict the arc of a thrown ball, and quantum mechanics explains all the strange stuff that happens with particles that are too small to see. And I think this is how trust works. So the trust between two friends is different from the trust we place in institutions or whole countries. But we often just use the one word, trust, for all these different situations. I think that can be quite misleading. It's like trying to use the rules for throwing a ball to understand how subatomic particles work. It just doesn't fit. So we need to be clear about what we mean by trust in different situations. And just as physicists use the specific terms for different scales, I think we should adopt better ways to talk about trust. And I actually propose some new terminology in the book to disambiguate that kind of relational versus institutional level trust. And I think when you do that, it makes it clearer to see when institutions try to trick us into acting maybe more intimately with them than we should. And like I say, there's a whole chapter on this, and it gets quite philosophical. But one of the possible outcomes of this confusion is when these different trust domains are deliberately conflated. So, for example, a state can potentially benefit from convincing citizens to view their version of digital ID with the same level of personal engagement maybe and trust that's typically reserved for relational interactions, and that's like treating an unknown government official as if they were a close personal friend with a shared history. And we need the language and the education to see that more clearly when it unfolds in our society. So I think we need more precise language to complement the precise modeling in our digital interactions. And I think that'll help onboard more of the public into this topic as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've actually got your book open at the moment, and I know you touch over a few points specifically related to SSI. You've mentioned a few of the products in there, whether it was Solana, you've mentioned ourselves. You also talk a bit about zero knowledge proofs, which is part of how SSI can work. And I'm not entirely sure what Melinda's understanding is this, so you'll have to forgive me here, Melinda, but just in terms of the understanding from your research, Paul, taking into account, some of the controversial opinions that are out there, do you think that SSI is a viable solution to build trust and certainly reputation between individuals, organizations, and AI?
Look, absolutely. And I think we shouldn't be held back from pursuing potential solutions to any problems that our species faces for want of a completely fleshed out solution. If I think it's sufficient to move forward with trying alternatives if we simply identify that what we have now is problematic. The the correct answer to that is that we won't know until we've actually shifted the world over to SSI, and it's only then when you actually see how the rubber meets the road. But look, all indications from my research is that it looks very promising. For the non-technical here, I might just briefly explain SSI in a bit more of a higher level. It's self-sovereign identity for the audience. And it's just a way to take control of your personal information online, like you do with more analogous to physical ID. So you have a digital wallet on your phone, say, and you keep your important details like your name and age and qualifications or really whatever you like. And you get to decide, what to share and with whom. So there's that choice factor there. And as you mentioned there, it opens up other features, that let you do impressive things like proving you're over 18 without revealing your actual age or your birth date. And there's some cool maths behind how all that works, which is beyond the scope of this. But look, essentially, I like to use the story of King Arthur, proving his suitability for the British throne as a bit of a loose, a coarse example of what these suite of technologies maybe can potentially allow us to do. So King Arthur didn't hold up his passport or some other centrally issued credential to prove his suitability. He just publicly displayed the widely accepted conditions for kingship. That's pulling Merlin's broadsword from the stone, and everyone could verify that proof with their own eyes. They didn't need a corruptible centralized body to kind of attest for him. So I think that's maybe a broad overview of the type of change that we're maybe advocating here. And why do I think SSI is maybe a great solution for trust? Well, our identities aren't static. They're constantly evolving. We're spiritually and physically and behaviorally different as we age. And so necessarily the identification systems that we're involved with also must evolve. And under the centralized paradigm, this means that systems controlled by others constantly hunt us to update their grip on our current traits and expressions and behaviors. And, we have little control over how our identities are used to restrict access to resources. And we see this kind of scope creep everywhere. And like in the ever increasing demands of KYC and AML legislation, for example, it was never really ideal, but today in the globally connected world, it's just reached its breaking point, I feel, and at best we're set to stagnate as a culture and as an economy. And I think, Fraser, I heard you say recently on a space that SSI flips the last 10 or 20 years of the internet, and that really, really resonated with me. It reverses what Phil Windley there calls the bundle of sticks approach, and it places the decisions in the hands of those who own the identity data, the individual. SSI is like giving custody of the shadow back to the object that casts it. And I feel only the individual truly knows what is appropriate to share in each interaction, and only they can assess what their own risk profile is as well in doing so. So I think it's a much more elegant solution.
Lovely. Any comment on that, Fraser?
Totally agree. Like it's and thanks for Paul for actually explaining SSI, because otherwise, we're an hour and 10 into something where it's kind of highly relevant topic, and it's actually in the title of the spaces, and we didn't actually explain it for anyone who's new to the topic. And it's actually, I think, just diving in on that, I think it is a SSI versus decentralized ID is semantically is an very interesting discussion, which I'll try and do in 2 minutes. There's SSI, like Paul was saying, is the idea that you are you not only the owner control of your identity, but SSI is also that you are the instantiator of that identity. And you can kind of completely own it and control it. Interestingly, when I was running projects with the government on digital ID for travel, so you're never getting around a passport for traveling. It's unless you're kind of doing it illegally. There's just never going to be a way around it. But what was interesting there was the governments were very much against the terminology of SSI, because from their perspective, you stating things doesn't mean anything unless they've been corroborated by someone who is an authority on whatever that thing is. And so from their perspective, like passports, it's going to have to come from them. Birth certificates, likewise. Boarding passes will have to be the airline, all this kind of stuff. Visas, again, government. But and so they were moving more towards self-managed or decentralized ID because they, philosophically struggled with this idea of like you just stating whatever you want about an identity. I think what's interesting though is if you take it away from the government context, and to your point, Paul, around relationships, even in that scenario, like you're not really self-sovereign. You're still defining yourself by the relationships you have with others, which I think it's always going to be the way. And it's why certainly on Creds, which we built as a product, we shifted more towards terminology of decentralized reputation, because it's even less to do with identity and yourself and more to do with who else are you interacting with, what is their opinion of you, what is like your historic, I guess, social graph, the building of trust between you, how long have you known each other, what context and where did you meet, all of that kind of comes together. So just a brief aside on like some maybe slightly relevant topic for this is just the semantics and how those are treated between SSI, decentralized ID, and then whatever term it's likely to migrate to in the future.
Thank you. There's a few things you touched on there, certainly around reputation, around our identity, but there's a strong argument that our identity isn't just about the attributes that we tie to our characteristics to identify who we are. Our reputation is who we engage with. It's what we speak about, and it largely about a lot of the facts we put out there. I mean, at the moment, there's examples of where you say something wrong and you can find yourself in a bit of trouble, subjectively, rightly or wrongly. Now, I believe in the full force of the law. Anyone who pushes any kind of hate speech whatsoever, I think should be dealt with. But also you're getting into the realms of freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And I just wanted to bring in Melinda here, because I know the title of your book, You Can't Say That, The Demise of Free Thought in Australia. I mean, there's an argument that actually, depending on what you say or what you think, you can be seriously ostracized, and then that actually treads on our right as individuals to be able to freely express ourselves in a way that shouldn't actually do any kind of harm. But I just wanted to bring you in to bring in some comment and tell us a little bit about your book in terms of our reputation and how our reputation can be trusted.
Yeah, look, this is it gets to be a little bit of a tricky area when we talk about individual reputations. I think our individual reputations are often tied to trends in society at the time. What I just have to really impress upon everyone very, very strongly is that we did live in a totalitarian society for 2.5 years where we were not free. We were not free to say what we wanted to say. We had the early signs of government tracking down people who were not following a very, very specific narrative about a virus and about how the government was implementing measures for a supposed virus to put a supposed vaccine into our bodies. Now, whether you agree with the narrative or you don't agree with the narrative, that's not the point. The point is that we stepped into a new world of totalitarianism. It could have been about a virus. It could have been about anything. But when people started to disagree with a government narrative and with medicine that turned into ideology, science that turned into ideology, and people that did not agree with the ideology that was being given to them, the government used the identifying markers of those individuals in different digital realms to track them down, in some cases arrest them, brutalize them, ostracize them. And if you did not have a digital footprint for a vaccine for a year, you were also ostracized from society. Now, we've already experienced that. Now, my reputation 3 years ago, I was seen as the absolute rebel. I was vilified. I was absolutely, put as an extreme human being simply for asking questions and for getting people to maybe try and have a think about things in a logical sense. So my reputation, I had a very clear positioning out there in society in 2021. In 2024, that's flipped 180 degrees because we learnt more information. People have woken up. I've had people apologize to me. I now have a lot more of a following. I have people coming to me and wanting more of my time and expertise because my reputation is now very, very different because it was being dictated to by an overseeing and an oversight from a government that had become too powerful, by a media that had become too powerful and was pushing lies out to the population. Now, we know that for a fact now. We know that. These are facts now that I'm talking about. So trust and reputation are very, very, they're very movable feasts. But what isn't movable is our basic human and civil rights and our absolute need to have freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and everyone must be able to lose the fear of speaking out. They must not be afraid to speak out. Now, there are laws in place already that protect people. There's defamation laws and hate speech laws. So of the times that we say to people, well, listen, hey, you can't say that. Absolutely. I mean, the title of my book is You Can't Say That. But I do realize that there are definitely specific times when you can't, threaten to murder someone. You can't actually defame someone individually and ruin their reputation. But there are laws to protect it. In any other circumstance, people have the right to have an opinion. They have the right to disagree with a narrative, and they do not have the right to be tracked down through the digital space to then be attacked, arrested, which is exactly what's happening in the UK. And it happened in Australia during 2020 to 2022. And that digital space and the identification of those individuals was part of the reason why that was able to be done. Relatively crudely, mind you, understanding that, but that digital space is getting sophisticated, and we need to be able to do exactly what cheqd's saying and say, okay, we've got to give people the control of their identity and the control of who they are, because it's as unique as our footprint. And we also need to give people the ability to be able to speak out and have a voice. Everyone needs that voice. And the digital ID has there is a danger there that certain identifiers of certain individuals will be used to suppress those individual freedoms.
Thank you. And I have to be very careful here. But I mean, during that time, there was a period of where people were taking offline for Twitter, for example, regardless of what they said was true or false. Physicists that signed the Great Barrington Declaration is one example. I won't go too far into this. But getting back to what Paul was saying, and then just going to come back to that in a second, it's important to have a balance between how we use those identity characteristics and tie it to a level of reputation in an appropriate way. Which brings me to my next question, actually, is how do we implement it? What's the fine line, and what's the best way to roll out a form of digital identity management? What are your thoughts on that, Paul?
Well, I've devoted a fair bit of time to that area as well. It's another great question because it's easy to talk in abstract terms, but yeah, we've got to start somewhere, right? And if there's maybe one initial guiding principle, I think that we could possibly consider, and I alluded to this earlier on in the introduction, particularly related to my career experience. I think we should be treating digital ID with the same safety critical mindset that we approach other industries like aviation. And I'm not necessarily calling for regulation here, but I think, I personally think that may somewhat defeat the purpose by putting the fox in charge of the hen house. But that aside, and given the regularly demonstrated inability for institutions to hold identifying data securely, and the fact that identity can be uniquely exploited and weaponized, as we've been talking about, we can't be treating digital ID with the same flippancy as we do other industries. I think there's a lot of maturing that needs to happen in our appreciation of that. And so I make a call to technicians and engineers to draw moral lines, because these systems ultimately will be built by someone. And so we need to appreciate where these moral lines are when deciding to work on any identifying systems. And actually, there's a particularly dark part in my book where I talk about some of the complicity of the HOMAG technicians in the Holocaust by their provision of servicing and support in environments that I won't go into in this space, but the punch card machines there I mentioned were run 24/7, and they needed a lot of maintenance, and they were being quite obviously used to allocate fates to people. And I just make the point that we all have a role in just saying no when any actor seeks to impose an identity system that just doesn't meet fail-safe criteria. And it's a big topic, but that would be my overview.
Just to jump on that as well, it's almost like viewing all of this as what could the unintended consequences. What could the unintended consequences be? I saw this as part of some innovation workshop years and years ago, whilst at Accenture, and it was giving an example of an invention and then a wild, it was quite a few leaps, but an unintended consequence of that invention and where it came from. And just a quick example, the example given was, this was a newspaper printing press in New York, I think, obviously a long, long time ago. During, I think, hot, humid summers, effectively it became very, very difficult to dry newspapers. So it was basically slowing down production, and they had to figure out a way of cooling these things down and making the ink dry. And that was basically the invention of AC. And so the invention of AC basically came off the back of just trying to dry these papers out and get more printed. It then obviously started to be used for cooling down living spaces. What that meant was previously uninhabitable areas of the US became habitable, and especially allowed more elderly people who were previously struggling with the heat to move and become comfortable. And it basically reshaped the voting map of the US off the back of just the invention of AC to dry some newspapers. So it's a lot of hops obviously on the way through, and decades in terms of time, but you've got this kind of strange causal link between all of these things happening. And the initiator of all of it was just trying to dry some newspapers out and inventing AC. And I think viewing digital ID, decentralized ID, all of this as this kind of paradigm shift, together, going, what could happen if this went wrong, I think is absolutely the right way of doing things, because it's high stakes poker. So totally agree. And I'm aware that we're coming up on time, so I want to make sure I've given Melinda plenty of time as well before I think we're wrapping up in a few minutes.
I'm okay to stay on with Melinda and Paul. I know you've got a hard stop, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move on to a few questions for you, Fraser, and then I know you need to get on to do some other things. So just taking into account the topics of the conversation that we've had, and then just bringing it back to cheqd and our solutions. Can you tell the listeners a little bit more about how our solutions allow individuals and businesses to monetize their own data or identity, as well as it being a form of identity that can benefit everybody from a privacy perspective?
Given the focus of this chat so far, I'm going to answer the second part first and then go back for the first one. So really it comes back to Paul's definition of self-sovereign ID. It's all about individual ownership, control, privacy, and the ability to know who's got your data and what it's being used for. And also, I think Paul's example of this data being on a memo that's still available, that I think one of the big kind of tenets or principles of SSI is that you should have that control, you should have that awareness. So if you want to remove access from people and you want to be able to tear down that relationship, you can. So there isn't this scenario where for no reason whatsoever, there's your data just kicking around with someone who shouldn't have it. So I guess really the core of this is that SSI, decentralized ID principle of individuals owning, controlling their own data and privacy, and maximizing the privacy angle as much as possible. So shifting away from systems which just ask you for everything because it's the easiest way, to focusing on core data attributes that are relevant to whatever service you're looking to access. So that's really the data, like that data paradigm is really the bit that solves for privacy ownership, that kind of stuff, and maintain that privacy. The monetization side of things. So the reality of where the world is currently is that organizations own or have harvested huge amounts of data on individuals, and they are willing to give it back, but they want to have some commercial argument to do so, in a way that companies want a commercial argument to do anything. So, but what we've understood, like we've spoken to, hundreds of companies across the year, especially during the Accenture period. And what's interesting is these companies are all made up of people. And so regardless of like this big corporate ambition and what the company wants to do, when you're speaking to individuals, they do want to adopt this paradigm because they see it for themselves. But it all comes down to everything is measured on dollars or pounds or Aussie dollars. And therefore you have to have a commercial argument for any change that goes on inside a business. And as a result, like whilst they're willing to adopt this paradigm and shift to this new data ownership approach, and even the privacy side of things, like even some of these companies, they don't want the data that they currently have and they'd much rather minimize it. They still need a commercial argument to do anything internally. So where we're focusing is every time data gets reused, there is some revenue that goes back to whoever issued it in the first place. Alternatively, if it is data you've created yourself as an individual, enabling payments for that data, as well as kind of buying data outright and owning it going forward. So the whole focus for us is providing incentives to release that data to individuals and do so at scale. And really the ultimate aim for all of this is getting that data back under the control of individuals, getting that privacy back under the control of individuals, and really changing that paradigm going forward. Sorry, that was such a long answer, Matt. I realized that in about 2 minutes I'm going to have to make a dash, but it's been a great panel to listen to.
Just one last question before you go, Fraser, because this one's important on the topic of trust. Now, we implement a concept of trust registries in the ecosystem. Can you tell us a little bit about how they work, how they're relevant to trust, and how they address concerns about centralization? And then you can go, I promise.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you. I'm going to lean back on Paul's answer from the start, or around the spectrum, and no one having control of all of the identity or identity attributes or credentials. There's a key part here, which is you obviously, if you're receiving data from someone else, you want to know that it's trustworthy. It shouldn't all be coming from one place, but as a result, you then need to have this kind of delegation and hierarchy of who do you trust for what credentials, who has a legitimate authority over who a practicing doctor is, who someone who is qualified to drive a train, all this kind of stuff. Each of these should have different authorities. They should be recognized and very easy to discover. And there obviously is like a hierarchy from, let's say it's a market trader who sells food. There's some local authority that manages all of those certifications, which are for like health and safety for food. But ultimately, that entity, that organization who issues those credentials, is themselves authorized and delegated to by a higher body. And then you kind of go up and up and up, and you kind of trace these trust relationships around. And trust registries basically as a function or a capability provide the ability for anyone to be able to traverse those trust relationships from whatever data you've received, whatever credentials you've received, and traverse it all the way back up to, okay, do I trust these organizations, and do I trust this like mesh of relationships and trust that kind of give authority to that entity? So there's a lot behind it, but ultimately it does provide the infrastructure so that you don't and shouldn't have any single organization issuing all of these credentials. You can get them from many, many different places, and combine them together in a way that's still very, very easy to understand.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Fraser. And thanks for stopping on for the last questions. I know you've got to drop off. So please feel free to do so. I'll carry on for the last bits with Melinda and Paul. But before you do you have any closing thoughts?
It's been a wonderful space. It's a content, like there's a lot of this which is contentious, but it's been a great debate and really, really enjoyed it. And would love to do it again. And Paul, we've been speaking for a long, long time. It's a pleasure to finally hear your voice. And Melinda, pleasure to meet you as well. Really, really great points throughout. So thanks for everything. And hopefully we'll be doing this again soon.
Likewise, Fraser. Thank you so much for your time and your mental energy.
Likewise. Thanks. All the best. Bye.
Cheers.
Okay, so Melinda, taking into account a lot of the stuff we've talked about, and I can fully understand a lot of the concerns you've conveyed throughout various points in the space. Do you feel that from what we've discussed today, that self-sovereign identity could be an opt-in solution for people to manage and control their identity in a way that they can benefit from? Or do you feel that it's maybe something you would like to keep at arm's reach?
I think that it is a very, very viable alternative to having the government have their fingerprints all over our identity. I think it's a viable alternative, and I think it's something that gives us hope that, like, no one wants to stop progression. I mean, even though, I'm not very good with technology, no one wants to, even people like myself don't want to stop progress. That would be ridiculous. What people like me, who are not tech savvy, are trying to say is that the government cannot be involved in being the custodians and the stewards of our individual identities. I do not believe that is viable, and I think that the SSI is certainly something that can bat that away. And that is first and foremost at the top of mind of anyone who is concerned about this digital ID bill. The fact that they even had to do one in the first place tells you all you need to know about our government at the moment in Australia. So yes, absolutely. It completely changes the paradigm and the ball game in that space. And I think that, if we were able to sort of talk to people about that, they can opt into that and opt out of any government forcing, any government trying to force us to do something that they've implemented and they want to do to control us. I think everyone can jump on board and say, well, look, hold on a minute. We can still do business. We can still transact, and we can still have our own digital ID, and we don't need the government involved. And I mean, for me, that's just absolutely critical.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Now, if I was interested to learn more about your personal thoughts from your book, You Can't Say That, could you share with us how we might be able to get a copy?
Yes, my book is just on, it can be from all good digital book outlets, but that if you want to have a look at a little bit more about who I am and buy it directly from me, it's on my website, melindarichards.com. So it's a very easy website to remember, and it's called You Can't Say That. And I have I just make some social commentary, and I talk about, Western civilization, 21st century feminism. I talk about freedom of speech, cultural values. I talk about a lot of the things that I think Western civilization is good about what we've done and where we've gotten to, but what we could potentially be losing. And the fact that we've really got to lose the fear of speaking out. And that's why I call the book You Can't Say That. And I really hope that people come back to all of us and themselves and each other, and they reconnect and start having the debates again and start learning how to debate and start believing that they don't have to self-censor when they're having in-depth conversations about what's going on. And I also hope that the book tells people that they're not alone, and it doesn't stop people from really getting their teeth into some political debate. I mean, Australians have really stopped talking about politics pretty much altogether. Now, by doing that, though, we've found ourselves in a very, very dire situation, where we now have the worst prime minister this country's ever had. And that's just because we're a pretty apathetic nation. We don't generally get involved in politics, and we allow people in political power to gain even more power, and they do it by stealth, death by a thousand cuts. But the book is really out there as a discussion point on a lot of those topics. Yeah. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about that.
No problem. What I'd like to do is actually, if you can ship to the UK, I'll get a copy. Hopefully it arrives before Paul's does, because I'm yet to receive that one yet. It would be great to actually cross-reference them both and then maybe invite you back for another discussion. I'd probably do it from my personal account, not the cheqd one, as to keep the brand out of it. But yes, if I shall send you a DM on Twitter, I can't at the moment because you're close to people who you don't follow. But we can have a chat on that. Paul, same question for yourself, sir. How can people buy a copy of your book?
Yeah, thank you very much. And before I go down that, I'd just like to reach out and express my thanks to you, Matt. It's been a fantastic space and well moderated and balanced, and I think we got to express ourselves really well without treading on too many toes. So real credit to you. But yeah, thank you. So paulgconlon.com is my website. I run a blog there and an email list, and I'm quite accessible. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to discuss any of this further or share ideas or any of that sort of stuff. I'm more than happy to connect to anyone who's willing. And yeah, you can buy the book there as well. And I'll mention as well that to celebrate this space, I think it's been quite unique and enjoyable. I've added a coupon code for 15% off the book as well for a limited time. So that'll that just put in cheqd at checkout, and yeah, that'll apply there. So yeah, I'd also be happy to sign it if anyone's interested in that as well. That'd be my pleasure. Just reach out and let me know. So yeah, look, there's a lot of different stuff in there for different people, everything from philosophy to technologies I mentioned, and I hope that it, like I said earlier, gives a voice to concerns that people have around the world at the moment in what is quite a complex space. So thank you for providing the forum to explore that here.
Not a problem. It was actually refreshing to see that you did actually look into our ecosystem to help people understand a little bit more that there are alternative solutions out there to what some deem draconian measures and, total surveillance capitalism. But I don't want to get into anything too far into that for now. I'd just like to thank you both for joining. I know it's late down now. We do have a couple of people from the other side of the world that are listening in, our ambassadors and the rest of the community. I'd like to thank you guys for joining and tuning in. I hope you took some insights from this conversation, and I'd very much like to hear your feedback in our primary channels as well, and it would be good to get some back to Paul and Melinda. We are now at 12:40, so I think we should probably wrap this up. But before we do, Melinda, do you have any closing thoughts?
I just wanted to say thank you very much for holding this space, and thank you for being part of an organisation that recognises that we as individuals are powerful and we should actually be in control of our identity, of our data, and we have to be the makers of our own destiny. And I think that for me is an underlying philosophy that I seem to be getting out of your organisation. So I feel I have hope. I have hope where I didn't have hope before. So thank you very much for including me on this space, particularly as I'm so non-technical. And I really appreciate you, I guess, bringing in the moral code and the value code into the organization as well, because, it's all very well for people to want to monetize things, but the fact that you have put someone like me on the space tonight shows that you have a breadth and depth to how you run your organization, which is really refreshing, particularly in this digital age. So thank you again for having me and to allow me to speak about my book and your moderation. It's been fantastic.
Thanks very much for your kind words. We do appreciate you being here. For me, it's been a great conversation. I just wish I could have discussed it a little bit more, but I can't. And from yourself, Paul, do you have any closing words for our listeners?
Oh, I think that sums it up nicely. I'm just left with appreciation and would certainly be interested in furthering the discussion down the track. I think it's well overdue, and it's just wonderful to hear some mature discussion. Maybe that's the start of a new trend, let's hope.
I certainly hope so. Well, thanks very much again. I hope you have a pleasant evening, and thanks for everybody that tuned in. Again, paulgconlon.com for Paul's book and melindarichards.com. Did I get that right, Melinda? melindarichards.com, nice and simple.